Footsteps in the desert, footsteps that changed the world. 2,000 years ago, an itinerant Jewish preacher set out. In the Holy Land, he preached renewal and love. He would be killed, but his message would survive. The story of Christianity, an endless procession of humanity, a road through the centuries full of error and confusion, full of devotion and passion, not made of historical dates, but rather lived by human beings. A story of suffering, but also a story of joy. At the beginning of the 18th century, the bloody conflict between Protestants and Catholics lost some of its ferocity. Religion and the church slowly took a back seat to a culture more oriented toward worldly matters, eager to liberate itself from every form of enforced thought control. The Cathedral of Saint-Denis near Paris. Here we find the remains of the French kings of the Middle Ages, a time when society was clearly structured. Above, rulers, nobility, and clergy. Below, the people. But at the end of the 18th century, enlightened and liberal individuals rose up against the old authority of king and church. This upheaval would turn society upside down. The people lost all respect for the kings, who now no longer reigned by the grace of God. Their tombs were torn out of the walls of the cathedrals, their remains shattered. Churches were laid waste, the destroyed walls hauled away as construction materials. Vengeance was taken on priests and bishops, who were regarded as confederates of the powerful. The revolution had its own bloody rules. At its climax, hundreds of clergy were dragged onto the scaffold. A contemporary witness reported, "This time it was Abbé Berthaud who was led to the slaughter. The revolting jeers of the spectators intensified the agony of the death penalty." As horrible as it became all the more hideous because of the sight of so much spilled blood. Fréjus, a city on the Mediterranean coast of France. The revolution gave the fishermen the privilege of carrying weapons, a right they are proud of to this day. But for a long time, there haven't been any revolutionary goals people need to shoot anyone for. Today, the fishermen fire shots to invoke the protection of the saints. The red cap was the symbol of the French Revolution. It was the cap of the liberated slaves from ancient Rome, the sign of freedom. Symbols of the revolution and Christian rights. The people and the church settled their grievances long ago. This procession with banner and statues honors the Virgin Mary, the protectress of the sea. The signs of the revolution have long since gone into the folklore. Southern France 2 centuries ago. The Provence town of Fréjus in the middle of a peaceful zone. A youngster of 17 set out for Paris. His name, Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès. The beauty of the southern French countryside, a deceptive idyll, the land at this time could barely nourish its population. Sieyès was the son of a poor, low-ranking tax collector. His lot was the same as many others in large families, a severe upbringing and doing without, no hope of even the most modest inheritance. His road led from the provincial town directly to the seminary for the priesthood in Paris. From here, he later wrote to his father, Dear Father, you have sent me on this way. Either I shall be able to support myself by it, or I shall go under. Sieyès began his studies at the Theological Seminary of Saint-Sulpice. Attending a seminary assured the sons of impoverished citizens some kind of livelihood. The church is a welfare institution. The alternative to joining the clergy was the army, le rouge ou le noir, red or black. The red soldier's uniform or the black cassock of the priest. Those were the two alternatives a gifted young bourgeois had in those days. For the weakly Sieyès, however, there was only one choice, the cassock. Sieyès experienced his religious education as a shock. This education, he wrote, is an inhumane system in which the educators invest a great effort in training their charges to take after some insane models while tormenting their pupils morally and physically. Sieyès quickly developed an eye for the social abuses of his time. He sought role models. Secretly, he plunged into the study of Enlightenment figures like Diderot, who rejected every belief that went beyond reason as a superstition and had atheistic tendencies. A fervent critic of the Catholic Church. Or Rousseau, who turned against every form of religious dogma. Traditional beliefs were being questioned more and more. Consecrated to the priesthood, Sieyès became Vicar General of the Diocese of Chartres, one of the oldest Catholic centers in the northern part of France. When the estates were convened, he became a clerical representative in the provincial assembly. The bridge from an ecclesiastical to a political career had been spanned, the start of a success story. The Cathedral of Chartres. For Sieyès, this was no ivory tower. He developed an ever keener perception of social realities. How can an individual fight to regain the rights that state and church withhold from him, he asked openly. And liberty, equality, and fraternity? Are these not Christian principles? In 1789, the year of the Revolution, this clergyman made himself an advocate of the downtrodden. What is the Third Estate, he asked provocatively. That same year, the supply of basic necessities was in a disastrous state. In Europe's richest country, people were starving. Crop failures and inflation threatened the population, yet the country was still at peace. What is the Third Estate became a question that would release a revolutionary explosion. It is nothing, but it will be everything, was the answering battle cry. The revolution would change all of Europe, even if at first only the French capital seemed affected. After all, things had been brewing for a long time in Paris, and not just because of the general famine. The ambitious bourgeoisie made the ideas of the Enlightenment their own. Voltaire's anti-church writings, a half-century old, may have been banned, but his teachings on the predominance of reason, however, were very much alive. And ancient dreams of freedom took on a form like the one realized by the Montgolfier brothers. Their hot air balloon was like a symbol of the limitless development of human possibilities. Time was ripe for a change. There were more than enough reasons to fight for a better life, a more just social order in pre-revolutionary France. The aristocracy lounged in their salons, oblivious to the worry and poverty of the people. The luxury of the most modern accomplishments, the new inventions, the art treasures were available only to the very few, about 1% of the population. And these few, in the exclusive splendor of their castles and gardens, failed to perceive that a new day had long since dawned. Despite the financial crisis, people lived as they always had in Versailles. Royal pomp and circumstance devoured 1/10 of the whole nation's annual income. People were living on the installment plan. Half of the state budget was consumed by interest on debt alone. The state was bankrupt. King Louis XVI failed to recognize the menacing danger. Basically endowed with the personality of a petit bourgeois, he nevertheless lived the usual life of splendor. The king and his people were worlds apart. The Queen, an Austrian woman from the House of Habsburg, was regarded with great mistrust by her French subjects. They considered her conceited and wasteful. Marie Antoinette would meet death like her husband under the guillotine. She would pay dearly for a life in luxury without ever comprehending why. The nobility, which put itself on monuments and regarded the Sun Kingdom as divinely ordained, closed its eyes to the starvation of the urban population and the destitution of the peasants on the land. A rumor made the rounds. Hearing the peasants crying for bread, the Queen cynically remarked, "Let them eat cake." The simple priests lived among the people, in straitened circumstances different from those of the clergy for the nobility, who took the side of the king and never came into contact with the lesser clergy. Abbé Sieyès distanced himself, as did many priests, from this Church of the King. He abandoned his ecclesiastical office and entered the service of something even holier, as he believed, the revolution. The oath of the National Assembly in Versailles. One name seems inconspicuous among the signatures on the minutes, Robespierre. This man would soon spread fear and horror throughout the land, even among the adherents to the revolution. He would set up a reign of terror, but many ecclesiastical revolutionaries continued to believe in the dawn of a better era, merely a utopia. More like a concrete vision, which would soon give France's church a brand new image. The radical upheavals in 1789 continue to exert an impact to this day. All church property and monastic possessions were nationalized, with the approval of many members of the clergy. Culture and church were to exist exclusively for the service of the people and the nation. A radical constitutional revolution was what they were striving for. Everywhere on the streets, things were coming to a head. The people made their own revolution. Their objective was bread and the destruction of the hated symbols of power. The king ordered his guards to surround Paris, a demonstration of power. The arsenals were filled. Soon Paris had become an armed camp. Like a spark in a powder keg, the customs houses at the city limits were set on fire, releasing a charge of pent-up loathing. Rampaging mobs broke down windows and gates and took possession of thousands of rifles, along with ammunition and gunpowder. The Bastille, the stronghold of kings, a synonym for totalitarian tyranny, the despised symbol of enslavement. Now the people of Paris took the fortress by storm. The Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. Today, among the hundreds of thousands of precious volumes from all eras, we also find perhaps the most significant document of the Revolution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, dated August 26, 1789. In a solemn declaration, the representatives of the French people consider that ignorance, forgetfulness, or disregard of human rights are the sole cause of public misfortune. That's how unambiguously the preamble to the Declaration of the Rights of Man stated the issue, supported by many members of the clergy, especially Abbé Sieyès. His words before the National Assembly made history. It is time, he said, to cut the line. Blue, white, red, the colors of the revolution. General Lafayette called to the representatives, "I give you a cockade which will travel around the world." The general's words would prove true. Lafayette, the commander of the National Guard, was also the initiator of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, for which he had already fought in the American Revolution in 1777. He was also a glowing figure at the great celebration of the first anniversary of the 14th of July. He swore the oath to liberty, the Constitution, and the law, to which the king also had to swear loyalty on the field of Mars. The triumph of the age was also reflected in the new architecture. As if everything had an ancient tradition, art now drew inspiration from ancient models. The law of the Republic was handed down to France by Pallas Athena. Entering onto the scene like antique graces, the allegorical figure of politics with the text of the law, pure philosophy and economics with the horn of plenty, the promise of the revolution. And above all, something borrowed from Christianity, the eye of God, now the eye of reason. Art which spanned the arch to every epoch of humanity, la liberté, freedom with the cap of a liberated Roman slave in front of a pyramid in the dawn of a new era. The Parc Monceau in Paris with the remains of the revolutionary monuments. The pyramid as holy mountain of remembrance, as a symbol of the connection with the oldest culture. Ancient tradition and the latest state-of-the-art technology. The revolutionary outbreak made reference to both. Enthusiastic dreams determined to rise into the heavens. Experiments with hot air balloons, now the skies would be conquered, for military purposes as well. Because the revolution was threatened from within, and especially from without. It took issue with the monarchical principle under which all of Europe was governed. Austria and Prussia threatened war if the revolutionaries were to dare lay a finger on the king. When the king attempted to escape from Paris in 1791, many people wanted to prosecute him for high treason. Foreign relations reached critical mass. In Great Britain, Spain, Prussia, and Austria, a concentrated resistance took form to combat the revolution. The French army was initially in a desolate state. Half of the officers had emigrated. Many had gone over to the enemy. With the recruitment of new soldiers from all levels of society, Europe saw the first patriotic national army. The Marseille Volunteers entered Paris singing a song of war. It would become the French national anthem, La Marseillaise. The revolutionary idea would spread throughout Europe to the sound of this melody. Bread, today a commonplace commodity, not just baked by the millions of loaves in French ovens. A food nobody in Europe has to worry about. But 200 years ago, it ignited the revolution of the people, which continues to impact on the entire Western world to the present day. Before the revolution, bread cost the common man almost 90% of his salary. The scarceness of flour first had the people in despair, then later cynical slogans cropped up. To the cry, "Now we'll have all the bread we want, we're bringing in the baker," the king was brought from Versailles to Paris to confirm the decisions of the National Assembly. An ancient symbol of Christianity, bread, also a symbol of the revolution. Versailles was abandoned. Louis XVI was accused of high treason. The king now also became a symbol of the counter-revolution. Wasn't he the one who stood behind a society of marionettes pulling all the strings? The cardinal, the minister, the nobleman, the officer, the court official were all shaking the tree of freedom, trying to harvest the fruits of the common people's labors. The French Revolution. It marked the turning point in the relationship of church and state. Since the time of Jesus, religious issues had determined the everyday lives of the people and the political lives of the nations. The medieval church and its bishops had even succeeded in getting the last word on all temporal issues. The culture was permeated with Christian dogma. With the dawn of the modern era, people began questioning the church's influence. Instead of the Christian message and profound piety, there were now three words which marked the people's understanding of the state and which were worth fighting for, as the people said: equality, fraternity, and liberty. Liberty, first and foremost from the authority of the church, which now had to redefine its relationship to political and cultural life if it wanted to avoid going under along with the deposed rulers. Louis XVI, degraded as traitor to the status of average citizen Louis Capet, was executed in January of 1793. This truly humane means of execution causes hardly any complaints. The delinquent feels a slight coolness on his neck, said the physician and parliamentarian Dr. Guillotin, explaining his invention, to which he would one day fall victim himself. Many people saw the Queen, the vivacious Marie Antoinette, as the vampire of France. She was brought in chains to the Conciergerie, the main prison of the Revolution, a building the people called the vestibule of the guillotine. Marie Antoinette was suspected of plotting with foreign powers. She also received the death penalty. She found out from her jailer that the horrible machine outside never rested. The avalanche of violence had been set in motion. It has been ascertained that since her arrival in France, Marie Antoinette has been the scourge and bloodsucker of France. So began the indictment. High treason. The evidence was sparse, but the verdict was certain from the start. Marie Antoinette wrote her last words.
I can expect no spiritual comfort, as I do not know whether there are still priests of this religion. I forgive all my enemies the grief that they have caused me. I die in the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman religion, the faith of my fathers, in which I was raised, and which I have always professed. I kiss my poor children. My God, how heartbreaking it is to leave them forever. Adieu. Adieu.
The sentence was read, her hands were tied, although she begged to be allowed to walk unshackled. Her hair was brutally cut off. Then she was led away by a rope around her neck. 30,000 gendarmes were on guard. Then the blade came whizzing down. No longer were all equal before God, but rather before the guillotine. The radicals under Robespierre now also regarded the clergy as enemies for their refusal to take the oath to the Constitution, because they regarded themselves as public officials in the service of the state. Sieyès also had to go into hiding. Accountable for the murders, Justice Minister Danton. Parliamentary whip Jean Marat coined the slogan, "Leave nothing behind but blood and corpses." The revolution was devouring its children. The Panthéon in Paris, this house of worship became a temple to memorialize the great men of the fatherland. The old religion was replaced by a new one. In the middle of the temple, a monument erected for the accomplishments of the revolution. The altar of the fatherland. The new saints in the Church of Reason were the Enlightenment figures who had brought the idea of liberty to their century, first and foremost Voltaire. He lies buried here, the assailant of prejudice and ecclesiastical domination, the fighter for tolerance. Voltaire, author, historian, philosopher. He expanded the human mind and taught it to liberate itself from the bonds of narrow-minded tradition. The grave of Rousseau, also a great thinker. Like Voltaire, he died more than a decade before the Revolution. Rousseau dreamed of a nation in which the rights of the individual would be one with the rights of the community. As he saw it, the natural condition of mankind was a condition of complete happiness, and it was the state, culture, and property that spoiled it. Growing up in Switzerland as the son of a watchmaker of Huguenot stock and a Geneva Calvinist, he fled to France at the age of 16. In the idyllic garden of his patroness, the Baroness de Varon, Rousseau found his image of God. In the place of Christ, he placed a God who could be experienced through the observation of natural order. Bringing about the greatest possible closeness to nature must thus be the task of every upbringing and religion. It took a Robespierre and his boundless lust for power to pervert the humane, romantic philosophy of this Enlightenment philosopher. A membership certificate of the Jacobin Club, the Society of Radical Revolutionaries. People in league with Robespierre's faction shut out anyone with different ideas. The Terreur became an established institution, which turned more and more against itself, against traitors in its own midst, and they were suddenly pinpointed everywhere. The prisons filled up. By the end of the Reign of Terror, some 17,000 heads rolled in Paris alone. An eyewitness reported, his tall body served his curiosity well. Now they dragged him upstairs. He looked over the executioner, the plank, and the murder instruments. The assembled crowd let out a cannibal yell. The brutality of the execution was considerably eased by the speed with which it took place. It was time for the sacrifice to begin. The executioner and his assistants set everything up. He grabbed the victim by one arm, the tall assistant grabbed the other, the second one his legs. Instantly, he was lying face down. His head was severed and the fully clothed body tossed on a tumbril where everything was awash in blood. And so it continued, on and on. What horrible butchery. Saint-Sulpice, Sieyès' former theological seminary, was expropriated. Priests who refused to take the oath to the Constitution were hunted down and arrested, as everywhere throughout the country. 30,000 went into exile, 2,000 were deported, hundreds executed. Under Robespierre, religion became a matter of government ordinance. The despot made himself a saint of a church with no other god but reason. The convent of the Carmelite order, reconstructed as a prison in 1792. This was the site of a mass murder, the traces of which are still visible to this day. The earthly remains of 150 priests. A massacre behind the walls of a cloister. The slaughter took 3 hours. excessive violence in the name of the revolution. We can still make out the lethal effect of the murderer's tools on these skulls and bones. The victims were given over to their hideous fate at breakneck speed, as the revolutionary reports proudly note, 1 murder per minute. The death industry. The traces of the mass murder can still be seen on the convent walls. Was this a triumph of reason? Was this the way to end the liberation of people from domination and oppression? Was this what not only the Third Estate, but also many from the ranks of the Church had been fighting for? Was this the final consequence of a constitution which, in many beautiful words, invoked the rights of man? Cluny, a small town in the French heartland, the center of French Catholicism since its first flowering in the 10th century. Here stood the largest sacred building complex in the Western world. Cluny, a symbol of the deep centuries-old roots of the Catholic faith in France. The great church reform of the 11th century went forth from this spot. The high towers of the venerable church building were now to be torn down, the government of the radical revolutionaries decreed, because their elevation above other buildings violates the principle of equality. The revolutionary spirit had gone wildly berserk in Cluny. The Revolutionary Army set fire to the furnishings and reduced the statues to rubble. Monastery complexes and churches were removed down to the foundations, and the ruins were later used as horse stables. Cluny became a stone quarry for construction material to be turned into money. The municipal archive in a small French village. To this day, documents are still preserved here recounting a development that was sensationally new for people at the end of the 18th century. The civil register shows how ecclesiastical duties would now be taken over by the state. Baptism, marriage, death. Suddenly all matters for the civil authorities. With hectic revolutionary zeal, everything was changed. Civil marriage replaced the sacrament of holy matrimony. Priests were now able to marry. And one more thing was brand new. Married couples could now be officially divorced with the blessing of the state. A systematic de-Christianization was put into effect, one that even brought about some odd consequences in graveyards. Priests were forbidden from practicing their ministry outdoors. A demand was made to dispense with the cross as a symbol. Sunday church services were categorically prohibited. In many parishes, churches were closed entirely and rededicated to reason. The cult of superstition and hypocrisy was replaced once and for all by a cult of the Republic and natural morality. Beside it, many a suspicious mystery cult flourished in secret. Prohibitions were enacted, cemeteries precipitously closed. For a long time, the response to these accomplishments on the part of the revolution had not been all positive. In Brittany and the Vendée, people resisted these innovations. Counter-revolution was the name the rulers in Paris gave this movement. The fight raged on bitterly on both sides. A 10-year-old child who called out "Vive la République" was executed on the spot by opponents of the revolution. A signal of brutality. Who was the victim? Who the criminal? A murderer and martyr at the same time? Jean Marat, the bloodhound of the terror. His credo, for the maintenance of public order, 200,000 heads are going to have to roll. A young woman, Charlotte Corday, managed to gain access under false pretenses to this ruthless revolutionary, in order, as she would later testify, to murder the monster. Marat, who spent most of his time in his bath because of a skin disease, admitted the young woman. She rammed the knife right through his chest. A surgeon couldn't have done a better job, a chronicler later commented. Marat, the beast, was dead. But the revolution lionized him like a saintly figure. A Marat cult came about. Monuments, even altars, were erected to his honor. Children were given his name. 29 cities were named after him. His embalmed heart was put on display in an urn like a relic. Art plunged the accomplishments of the revolution into the noble light of ancient history. Year one of a new epoch was commemorated on memorial plaques. The allegorical figure of the revolution, healthy and powerful as Hercules, trounces the lame-brained black-winged angel, the old religion. Illusions of the dawn of a brand new day. Notre Dame Cathedral. It had meanwhile become a temple of reason, but the blood of the murdered continued to flow down the Seine. Gravestones in Picpus Cemetery, a cross-section of 18th century society. Members of all classes lie buried here. The bodies of the executed were quickly interred in a mass grave here, under cloak of night, like the Carmelite sisters from the nearby convent, of whom it was said they went off to their deaths singing. This chapel is a place of contemplation and remembrance of the victims of the revolution. The Sisters of the Order of the Adoration of Christ still pray every day for the executed, as well as for their executioners. A place of meditation, also a place of forgiveness. What might ultimately have been the reason for this unparalleled burst of violence, to which artisans and aristocrats, priests and princes, citizens and paupers, children and women all fell victim? Was this radical cleansing the only way the Republic could survive? Was it a fanatical love of power? Was it paranoia? Or justice confused with terror? Or was it just sadistic madness? The answer of the nuns at Picpus is prayer. The end of the revolution came about rapidly. Danton, who had thousands executed, ended on the scaffold himself, and finally with his henchman, even Robespierre. The death machine of the revolution finally landed on the scrap heap of history. But the effect of the reign of terror on the human soul drew odd circles. Reports told of solemn dances. Women who had lost relatives beneath the guillotine danced at so-called dances of the victims to memorialize their dead and celebrate their own survival. A macabre dance of death. One of these women was Joséphine Beauharnais, the subsequent wife of Napoleon. She perpetuated her memory as a prisoner in the Carmelite cloister by signing her name on the wall. We can still see it there today. Sieyès, who had cleverly remained aloof, reappeared on the political scene when the danger had passed. As a member of the newly created Directory, he was presented with this honorary weapon for services rendered. He had rescued his reputation and his life. Sieyès now demanded political stability. "I need a sword," he cried out in the circle of his trusted associates, "but who shall bear it?" The new bringer of salvation, Napoleon Bonaparte, Sieyès prepared his way. Napoleon declared the revolution over, and he was also the one who created a modern code of laws based on human rights, the Code Napoléon. And the agreement with the Catholic Church, the Concordat. Securing justice in difficult times, Catholicism was recognized as the religion of the majority of the French, but the separation of church and state remained in force. Soon the Pope would crown Napoleon Bonaparte emperor. The internal war was over. The war with many other European powers, however, continued. Soldiers brought the horrors of war and along with it the idea of equality and fraternity. But, as so often in history, liberty fell by the wayside under Napoleon. The huge empire stretched from Spain to Russia, from the Baltic to Italy. It may have been conquered, but it could not be maintained. The gain for Europe was ultimately a spiritual one. The tomb of Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès. His life spanned the entire epoch of the violent upheaval, an age of the dawning dominion of reason, which badly shattered the tradition of the Church. The separation of church and state was the great innovation of this epoch. During the centuries-long march of Christianity through history, through joy and sorrow, through peace and war, never was a dividing line so clearly drawn. Religion had always been part and parcel of political intentions. The modern era put the temporal power of the church in question. But that was no loss. By doing this, it gave Christianity back its old opportunity, the possibility of concentrating freely on the message of Christ.